Ron Ellis stood at the podium in the high school auditorium, holding a piece of paper with 11 names written in his careful handwriting. The September heat had made his dress shirt stick to his back, and his hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper. Behind him, a large American flag hung motionless in the still air, and before him, 200 people sat in folding chairs, waiting for the annual 9/11 memorial service to begin. "I'd like to read the names of my brothers who didn't make it home," Ron said into the microphone, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. That's when everything went wrong. A young man in the third row stood up abruptly, his phone already recording. He was thin, sharp-featured, wearing an expensive polo shirt that screamed, "College Trust Fund." His voice carried clearly through the auditorium. "Wait just a minute," the young man called out. "I did some research on this guy. Checked the military databases, the veteran registries. This man's service records don't exist. He's a fraud." The silence that followed was deafening. Ron looked down at the paper in his hands, the names of his dead friends swimming before his eyes. Someone in the back row coughed. A cell phone camera flashed. "His name doesn't appear in any official military database," the young man continued, his voice gaining confidence. "No record of deployment to Afghanistan. No record of the unit he claims to have served with. This is stolen valor, plain and simple." Ron folded the paper carefully, set it on the podium, and walked back to his seat in the front row. He didn't defend himself. He didn't explain. He just sat down and stared at his hands, while the murmur of shocked conversation grew louder around him. The veteran sitting next to him, Mike Torres, president of the local VFW post, shifted uncomfortably in his chair and moved slightly away. Other veterans in the front rows exchanged glances, uncertainty creeping into their faces. The young man was still standing, still recording. "My name is Jason Hartwell," he announced. "I'm an investigative blogger, and I believe our veterans deserve better than to have their sacrifices mocked by imposters." What Jason Hartwell didn't know, what the databases couldn't tell him, was that Ron Ellis had indeed served with the 173rd Airborne Brigade in Afghanistan from 2003 to 2004. He'd been a staff sergeant, squad leader, a man who took care of his soldiers and brought them home when he could. The ambush happened on a Tuesday morning outside Jalalabad. Ron's squad was returning from a patrol when the RPGs started falling like deadly rain. The explosion that flipped their Humvee also buried most of their radio equipment under 2 tons of twisted metal and burning fuel. Ron had pulled 3 men from that wreckage while machine gun fire stitched patterns in the dirt around them. Private Lewis Carter, 19 years old, with a bullet through his left leg. Specialist Mike Donovan, 22, unconscious and bleeding from a head wound. Corporal James Wu, 23, with shrapnel in his chest, but still trying to fight. 11 other soldiers died that day. Their names were on the paper Ron had carried to the podium. The problem was paperwork. Ron's unit had been transferred to a different command structure 3 weeks before the ambush, and then that new unit was disbanded a month after his medical evacuation. His service records got lost somewhere in the bureaucratic shuffle between the Pentagon and the Department of Veterans Affairs. Digital databases didn't capture the chaos of a military reshuffling itself during wartime. Ron had spent 2 years after his discharge trying to straighten out his records. But the diabetes that had worsened from stress and poor field nutrition, combined with PTSD that made phone calls to government offices feel like enemy contact, eventually wore him down. He'd given up fighting the system and just tried to live quietly. The video of the accusation went viral within hours. Stolen Valor Exposed at 9/11 Memorial had been viewed 50,000 times by evening, with comments ranging from outraged to suspicious to supportive. Local news picked it up. someone created a Facebook page called Millbrook Stolen Valor Fraud Watch. Ron Ellis became a pariah overnight. At the hardware store where he'd worked part-time for 3 years, customers started avoiding his register. His supervisor, a good man named Jim who'd served in Vietnam, called him into the office Wednesday morning. "Ron, I'm sorry, but I'm getting calls," Jim said, not meeting his eyes. "Corporate says I need to let you go until this gets sorted out." "I understand," Ron said quietly. At the VFW post, where he'd volunteered every Thursday, serving coffee and organizing food drives for struggling veteran families, the reception was colder. Mike Torres pulled him aside after the weekly meeting. "Look, Ron, I've known you for 5 years. You've never given me reason to doubt you. But," he gestured helplessly, "people are asking questions. Maybe you should stay away for a while." "Until when?" Ron asked. "Until you can prove you served." "And if I can't?" Mike Torres looked away. "Then I guess we'll know, won't we?" What Ron didn't know was that Jason Hartwell was the son of Congressman Richard Hartwell, who had served on the House Armed Services Committee from 2001 to 2007. During that time, Representative Hartwell had been a vocal advocate for fiscal responsibility in military spending, particularly targeting what he called excessive veterans' benefits and redundant rehabilitation programs. Ron remembered Richard Hartwell's name from the rejection letters he'd received when trying to get disability compensation for his friend Marcus, who'd lost both legs in the same ambush, but was denied benefits due to a paperwork error. Marcus had killed himself 2 years later, alone in a VA hospital waiting room while filling out forms for the 3rd time. The irony wasn't lost on Ron. The son of the man who'd helped break the system was now using that same broken system to destroy him. But Jason Hartwell didn't know any of this. To him, Ron Ellis was just another faker trying to steal honor that didn't belong to him. The young man had started his stolen valor investigations as a college journalism project and discovered he had a talent for research and righteous indignation. His blog had gained a following, and his father's political connections had given him access to military databases that most people couldn't reach. Jason was genuinely convinced he was doing good work, protecting real veterans from imposters. The fact that his methods might destroy innocent people never occurred to him. By Friday, Ron had stopped leaving his house except to buy groceries. His small ranch home on the edge of town felt like a bunker, and he found himself checking the locks repeatedly and staying away from windows. The phone calls had started Wednesday night. Most were hang-ups, but some were worse. Voice messages calling him a fraud, a coward, a disgrace. Someone spray-painted "faker" on his mailbox. Thursday evening, Mike Torres showed up at his door with 3 other VFW members. They looked uncomfortable but determined. "Ron, we need to talk," Mike said. They sat in his living room, these men he'd considered friends, and delivered their ultimatum with the awkward formality of a military tribunal. "The VFW board met tonight," announced Pete Williams, a Gulf War veteran who'd never particularly liked Ron, but had always been professional. "We voted to suspend your membership pending verification of your service record." "We're not saying you're lying," added Carl Mason, a Vietnam vet who collected military memorabilia. "But you understand our position. If you can produce documentation—" "I've been trying to get documentation for 15 years, Ron said quietly. "Then try harder," Pete replied. "Because until you do, you're not welcome at the post." After they left, Ron sat in his kitchen and looked at the .45 pistol he kept in the drawer next to the stove. It would be easy. 1 bullet, and the humiliation would end. No more suspicious looks, no more whispered conversations that stopped when he entered a room. He thought about his wife, Ellen, dead 3 years from cancer. About his son, David, killed by a drunk driver in 2015. About the 11 men whose names he'd wanted to read at the memorial service. The gun felt heavy in his hands. Lewis Carter got the phone call from his sister on Saturday morning. She'd seen the viral video and recognized the name. "Lewis? Isn't that the sergeant who saved you in Afghanistan? The one you always talk about?" Lewis, now 38 and missing his left leg below the knee, sat in his wheelchair in his apartment in Phoenix and felt something cold settle in his stomach. He found the video online and watched it 3 times, his hands shaking with rage by the end. Staff Sergeant Ron Ellis had carried him 600 yards under enemy fire, refusing to leave him behind, when Lewis begged him to save himself. Ron had kept pressure on Lewis's bullet wound while they waited for medevac, talking to him about baseball and home and anything else that might keep him conscious. "You're going to make it, Carter," Ron had said. "You're going to go home and marry that girl and have kids and tell them their daddy served with heroes." Lewis had never gotten the girl, and he'd never had kids, but he'd never forgotten the man who saved his life. He called in sick to his job at the VA office and bought a plane ticket to Texas. Sunday morning, Ron Ellis sat in his truck in the parking lot of First Baptist Church, where the memorial service had been rescheduled after the controversy. Through the windshield, he could see people filing into the building. Some he recognized, neighbors, veterans, people he'd known for years. None of them looked toward his truck. He decided he wouldn't go in. He'd just sit here and remember his friends quietly, alone, the way he probably should have from the beginning. That's when he saw Lewis Carter's wheelchair rolling up the sidewalk toward the church entrance. Ron blinked hard, certain he was seeing things. But no, there was Lewis, older and grayer, but unmistakably the young soldier Ron had pulled from the wreckage 15 years ago. Lewis paused at the church steps and looked around the parking lot until he spotted Ron's truck. Their eyes met through the windshield, and Lewis smiled, the same crooked grin he'd had at 19. Lewis wheeled himself over to the truck and knocked on the window. Ron rolled it down with trembling hands. "You gonna sit out here all day, Sergeant, or are you coming inside?" Lewis asked. "I don't think I'm welcome," Ron said. "Well, then I guess I'm not welcome either. Because where you go, I go. That's how it works." Lewis rolled his wheelchair back toward the church entrance, not looking to see if Ron was following. But Ron was. He got out of his truck and walked beside Lewis as they entered the building together. The conversation died when they appeared in the doorway. Jason Hartwell was there, sitting in the third row with his phone ready. Mike Torres and the other VFW members were in their usual spot near the front. Everyone turned to stare. Lewis Carter rolled his wheelchair to the front of the church and positioned himself behind the podium. He adjusted the microphone and looked out at the congregation with calm, steady eyes. "My name is Lewis Carter," he said. "I served with the 173rd Airborne Brigade in Afghanistan from 2003 to 2004. I was wounded in action outside Jalalabad on September 15th, 2003. He paused and looked directly at Jason Hartwell. "The man sitting in the back of this room, Sergeant Ron Ellis, carried me 600 yards to safety while taking enemy fire. He saved my life and the lives of 2 other soldiers that day. 11 of our brothers died in that ambush." Jason Hartwell's phone was recording, but his face had gone pale. "You want to see documentation?" Lewis continued. "Here's my Silver Star citation. It mentions Sergeant Ellis by name." He held up an official-looking document. "Here's my medical records from the field hospital. Sergeant Ellis is listed as the soldier who provided first aid." The church was dead silent. "Now, I understand that Sergeant Ellis's service records were lost in a bureaucratic shuffle. That happens more than you might think. Databases aren't perfect. Files get lost. But I'm here to tell you that this man served with honor and courage. Lewis's voice grew stronger. You want to know why he didn't defend himself when you accused him? Because real soldiers don't feel the need to prove themselves to people who weren't there. Because when you've carried your dying friends in your arms, some punk kid with a computer doesn't seem worth arguing with. He looked around the room, making eye contact with every veteran present. Sergeant Ellis saved my life. If you can't find him in your databases, then delete me too, because I'd rather not exist in your records than exist in a world where we eat our own. Lewis wheeled back from the podium and positioned himself next to Ron's chair. The two men sat together in the front row as Pastor Williams resumed the memorial service. Jason Hartwell slipped out the back door during the opening prayer. His phone stayed in his pocket for the rest of the service. The video of Lewis Carter's defense spread even faster than the original accusation. By Monday evening, it had been shared 200,000 times. News outlets picked it up. Veterans organizations started calling. The Department of Defense announced they were reviewing their records management systems. The VA promised to investigate cases of lost documentation. Jason Hartwell's blog disappeared from the internet. Mike Torres and the VFW board voted unanimously to reinstate Ron's membership and issue a formal apology. But Ron Ellis didn't come to their meetings anymore. He'd moved to Phoenix to be closer to Lewis Carter, who'd become the brother he'd never had. They met for coffee every morning and talked about baseball and the weather and anything else except the war. Sometimes Lewis would ask Ron why he'd never tried harder to prove his service, why he'd just accepted the accusations in silence. Because, Ron would say, the men who were there know the truth, and the men who weren't there, their opinion doesn't matter to me. He never read the names of his fallen friends at a memorial service. But every September 15th, he and Lewis would sit quietly together and remember 11 soldiers who died in the dust outside Jalalabad. And that seemed like enough honor for the dead. On the day Ron moved to Phoenix, he found a letter slipped under his door. It was from Jason Hartwell, written in careful handwriting on expensive paper. Mr. Ellis, it read, I was wrong about you, and I'm sorry. I thought I was protecting real veterans, but I realize now that I was just protecting my own sense of righteousness. I've deleted my blog and stopped doing investigations. I hope someday you can forgive me for the harm I caused. Jason Hartwell. Ron read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it in his wallet next to a faded photograph of 11 young soldiers standing in the Afghan sun, their faces bright with the invincible confidence of youth. He never wrote back to Jason Hartwell, but he kept the letter anyway. Because forgiveness, like courage, doesn't always need to be spoken aloud to be real. Lewis Carter was waiting in the truck when Ron came out of the house for the last time, carrying a single duffel bag with everything that mattered to him. As they drove toward the highway, Lewis asked if Ron wanted to stop at the cemetery to visit his wife and son. No, Ron said quietly. They know where I'm going. The truck disappeared into the Texas morning, carrying two old soldiers toward whatever came next, bound together by shared survival and the unbreakable understanding that some debts can never be repaid, only honored through the quiet dignity of simply continuing to live.